Do you know that a kid refusing to go to bed could be a sign of an anxiety problem? It's true. I'm a child psychologist, and I'm here to tell you about 4 things that most people don't realize are signs of emotional difficulties in kids. Let's dive in. Hi out there. This is Dr. Brett Pearce, child psychologist, coming at you with another educational video. Do you know, many people understandably don't realize that kids, like adults, even young kids, can have mental health difficulties, things like anxiety, depression, trauma, things like that. Instead, people tend to describe pretty much any time that a kid is not doing well with their behavior as just a behavior or a discipline problem. And the richness and the inner life of what's going on for the kid often gets missed. And without intending to, we can sometimes contribute to or perhaps allow a mental health difficulty to persist. So the following are 4 things that often happen with kids that get branded misbehaviors when actually they can be a sign that a kid is having an emotional difficulty. So the first one that I already mentioned in the introduction to this video is a kid who is having a hard time going to bed, particularly when you're talking about a kid who outright refuses to go to bed, or perhaps they start to get really wound up and perhaps tantrum a lot, or maybe they get really kind of gamey. And what I mean by that is like maybe they get overly silly and things like that. A lot of those things can be basically like an avoidance behavior, because very often when kids are struggling with anxiety, which is to say they get nervous and scared very easily, that anxiety goes when it's nighttime. That's actually true of adults too. For example, anxiety is one of the number 1 causes of sleep difficulties for folks. So with kids, what often happens is they go to sleep in their own room. It's dark. Their imaginations are going nuts. And their anxiety starts to go through the roof. And anxiety is a very powerful aversive emotion that tells you, get rid of me. And so kids, very understandably, feel less anxious when they're around and close to their parents. And so your kid refusing to separate from you to go to bed is, or at least could very likely be, a sign that your kid is actually quite anxious at bedtime and is doing everything she can in order to avoid that anxiety. So just something interesting to think about. I have other videos that talk about what to do, by the way, about many of these problems. So, common childhood difficulty number 2 that many people don't realize can be a sign of a mental health problem is frequent behavior problems of any kind, like defiance or aggression or just kind of rule breaking. Now, again, this is one area where it's understandable that people tend to just view these as behavior problems and as discipline issues. And it's true that perhaps sometimes what we think of as discipline can be a piece of the solution, I suppose. But in general, it's important for us to think about the fact that people, including kids, don't do things, particularly important things, that make other people upset, especially their loved ones, parents, siblings, spouses, whatever, randomly. We don't misbehave randomly. There's always a purpose and a function to behavior. And very often when kids are struggling with a lot of misbehavior, they don't want to listen, they start to get aggressive, they start to hit, they start to have tantrums perhaps. It's a sign that they're not doing well with their feelings. They could be dealing with something like anxiety or depression, or it could be an indication of another mental health difficulty like ADHD. But we have a tendency to avoid looking at the emotional difficulties that often drive those problems. A kid hits, for example, because a kid's angry. And anger, as most people know, is a secondary emotion, which is to say it doesn't occur by itself, but rather with something else. So on the outside, we see the anger. The anger is real and important. But on the inside, what we have is something like fear or sadness or grief or hurt. And so if your kid's angry a lot, your kid's also got more of a primary emotion underneath that. So Same thing with tantrums. Tantrums are about difficulty regulating feelings, especially painful feelings like fear or guilt or sadness or perhaps, trauma or something like that. And so if a kiddo is having lots of tantrums, it doesn't necessarily mean that something deep and dark is going on per se, but it's certainly an indication that your kid is overly stressed out, struggling with a mood problem, struggling with too much anxiety, something like that. That's what a tantrum is through and through. It is kind of like an emotional storm. So, if your kid's struggling with misbehaviors, it can be a sign that your kid's struggling with feelings. In fact, I would basically argue it's effectively always what's going on. So, common childhood difficulty number 3 that gets viewed as just a misbehavior when often it's a sign of a mental health concern is school refusal. And by school refusal, I mean the refusal to go to school. So I don't necessarily mean, kids who are kind of grouchy about it once in a while and need some extra support. I don't really mean, isolated, transient, not so big of a deal problems. I mean a kid who is just going, nope, I am not going to school, and outright refuses to go. Now, this is not me trying to say that there's something wrong with that kid, but when we just plain refuse to go show up to and attend to a really critical component of our lives, like school or a job or something like that, it is not a good sign. It is generally a sign that we are too sad, too anxious, something like that, perhaps too traumatized to be able to cope with the situation enough to be able to make it work. And in general, child mental health professionals in particular regard school refusal as a big red flag. And not only is it certainly a merit for obtaining mental health treatment of some kind, it can often be by itself a justification for obtaining like a higher level of care, like going to kind of like a therapeutic school program or something, at least until the problem's resolved. So again, school refusal, often treated and dealt with as just a discipline issue, when, in fact, almost always in my experience, and I've dealt with school refusal many times, you're talking about a kid who's way too anxious or way too depressed to show, to make it work. And so it's definitely something to take seriously. The fourth and final one that I would like to talk about is the subject of video games and screens and electronics. I rant and rave about this a lot on this channel because I think that screens and electronics are an important subject, but I think that they are blamed way too much for mental health concerns. That being said, I will certainly admit that if your child dearly struggles with playing video games or being on electronics way too much, particularly if it's a big drama, whenever we try to set limits around it or say, okay, you've had your 2 hours, please give me the iPad back or whatever, and it turns into a massive blow up really consistently, that's definitely a sign that your kiddo is struggling. Now, what your kiddo is struggling with, well, I get a little bit hesitant about the idea of electronics or video game addiction. I'm not saying that I don't think it exists, but I think that we lean on that idea way too frequently, yet again, without really viewing the underlying thing. It's like we want to blame the video games or blame the electronics or the device. Usually what's going on in situations like that is that you have a kiddo who is over-relying on a certain kind of coping strategy, because video games and electronics are really popular these days. They're really, really rewarding. They're fun. They involve, lots of goal-directed activity. They involve a lot of instant access to a lot of really fun, awesome things. There are even social activities these days because you hang out with your friends, either friends in your neighborhood or friends that you've made through the internet, and you play and you do things together. So they're highly rewarding. They're highly valuable. They're a lot of fun. And kids who are struggling, just like adults who are struggling with things like anxiety and depression, are very often looking for relief. And folks who struggle with anxiety and depression, it's legitimate that very often they find themselves over-relying on certain coping strategies that are immediately available, that provide a high level of relief, that are not exactly terribly challenging, don't really require them to learn kind of new ways of thinking and behaving and things like that. And that's understandable, because when you're anxious or depressed, your resources are really overwhelmed and overloaded, and it's difficult to get access to better ways of coping. So we could get into the details of all of that. But what I would say about video games as being sort of a sign that your kid is struggling, it's more that, again, I encourage folks to look at the underlying reasons behind why video games are, a problem for your kid. It could be that we're dealing with something like an addiction where video games are addicting, but it probably, in my opinion, is more like you've got a kiddo who is struggling with emotional difficulties and has just found that video games are a very immediately available and very effective escape from the whatever feelings and stresses are not workable for them. So it's just something to think about. So at any rate, I hope you enjoyed this video. Please consider subscribing to the channel if you found this content to be of use. You can also give me a thumbs up, which also helps the channel out. Otherwise, we will see you in the next one. Take care.